The next thing I want to focus on with analog heat is the envelope follower. This is a very powerful feature because we can make it so that analog heat will modulate certain parameters based on the incoming audio. I'm going to put analog heat over here on my heated drums track. So those are the drum sounds that were resampled after heat was applied. And I've initialized my preset already, so we're in a good spot. If I play the drums right now, heat isn't doing anything. We have the clean boost setting. I haven't changed the drive or the dirt. So right now we're just hearing the drums basically as they are. And if we look at the envelope follower section over here, we see this little meter is showing us the incoming audio. Now, like I said, I can make it so that I can modulate a parameter within heat based on the volume of the audio. Once the audio gets louder, the modulation will be stronger. I'm going to apply this to, let's see. I think a good way to hear the effect of this is to apply it to the wet level first. But let me go ahead and go with a more aggressive distortion circuit. Let's try round fuzz here. All right, so right now we have the wet level all the way up and the dry wet mix is completely wet. And what I want to do is make it so that when the volume of the drums gets louder, the wet level will decrease. So right here it says destination, and I'll click here and I want to select wet level, which is there. I'll close this. And now this knob to the next to it is the depth. So if I increase this, every time the volume gets louder, the wet level will increase. If I give this a negative value, every time the volume gets louder, the wet level will decrease. So let's play this again, and I'm going to bring this down. And we can see with the wet level knob, the amount of modulation that's happening. And again, it's reacting to the incoming audio. Now we have an attack and release right here. If I want this to go back to the higher wet level very quickly after the attack of the kicks and the snares after the loudest volume, I can make the release time shorter. And now when the volume drops, the wet level increases more quickly. If I want this to react a bit more strongly, if I want this to dip even further in volume, I can increase the gain going into the envelope follower. And we see that's pretty extreme. Let me reduce it a little bit. All right, there we go. Now, I don't really think that that's the most effective way to use it in this particular scenario, so I'm going to try something a little bit different here. Let me set this back to 0. And instead of modulating the wet level, I think what would be cool is to utilize this for some parallel processing. So I'm going to go ahead and balance the dry and wet level, like so. And let's give this a good amount of dirt. Now I'm going to reduce the drive just so we can hear what it sounds like when the drive is lower. Okay. And I think instead of setting the destination to the wet level, I'm going to set the destination to the drive here and do something similar. When the volume gets louder, the drive will decrease. And again, we can see the amount of modulation happening right there. If I increase the wet mix. So now, basically when the kick hits, we're getting the least amount of drive. And then everything else that's a little bit quieter is going to get more of the round fuzz effect. Now, another useful way that we can take advantage of the envelope follower is by using this trigger level. And this trigger level will determine when the LFO gets re-triggered. We see up here it says trigger mode for the LFO, and we have a bunch of different trigger modes that we can choose from. If we have this set to the free mode, then the trigger level for the envelope follower is going to be ignored. So for example, let me go ahead and just set the drive to 0, so we just hear the effect of this. And let's reduce all that some. All right, so I'm going to drop this down here. And we can see when the audio goes above this line, the trigger level, this red dot comes on. Now, if we just look at the LFO, there's a dot here that's moving through the phase of the LFO. This is the beginning of the LFO's phase. And when the free trigger mode is set, this is ignoring the trigger level here. And I'm going to change this from free to trig, and just keep your eye on this dot here. So now every time the audio goes above this trigger level, the LFO starts over. It gets re-triggered by the trigger level set here. So we can use this to modulate yet something else. Maybe we'll have this modulate the filter. Let's go ahead and let's see. Well, I can use LFO depth right here, so. So we can see here the frequency knob. Every time audio is going above the trigger level, the LFO is starting over, and right now the LFO is modulating the filter frequency. And then we can still use the envelope follower and assign this to something else. So maybe I'll also assign this to the drive. So I have a very different sounding drum beat from what we started with. If we bypass this and activate it, so one last thing to point out with the envelope follower is that we can see right here, this is basically showing us the entire frequency spectrum, and we can make it so that this reacts not to everything that's being generated, but just to certain frequency ranges. If I reduce the width here and leave the bass set at 0, now the envelope follower is only going to react to the lowest frequencies. And if I keep the width relatively narrow and move the bass, then I can make this react to the mid-range frequencies or the higher frequencies. So again, this is a very nice way to kind of sculpt the sound and make it so that the analog heat is only going to react to specific moments in the audio. It's a very, very nice feature and one that should be explored thoroughly.